The counting room of the Vothentide tallied 1,040 ships, and not one of the counters felt afraid. Quillmaster Senna had spent her whole life inside numbers, and numbers had never lied to her. She sat in the high gallery above the muster pool, where the war clerks of the Vothan hegemony stacked their slates and called out tonnage, and she watched the great pool fill with the lights of the fleet. Each light was a hull, each hull was 1,000 soldiers, or 10,000, or 100 siege drones folded into its belly. She did not need to feel brave. Bravery was for small numbers. The Vothan never fought small. The fleet was called the Hand of 40 Suns, and it had been gathering for 9 cycles. It had come to a quiet edge of the galaxy to do a quiet thing. There was a single yellow star out there, with a single blue world, and that world had been making noise. The noise was not weapons. The noise was words. The blue world had been telling the older species of the Rim that the Vothan tally was a lie, that the hegemony counted its enemies as already dead, that a thing counted was not a thing won. The blue world had said this in open broadcast, in 9 languages, for 2 whole cycles. And the Vothan did not allow noise, so they sent 1,040 ships to make the noise stop. Senna marked the number on her master slate and felt the old satisfaction of a clean column. 1,040. The blue world, by every scan the forward scouts had returned, held nothing that could be called a fleet. It held cargo haulers. It held mining tugs with cutting lasers bolted to their noses. It held 1 military hull, and that hull was so old its drive signature did not match any active pattern in the Vothan archive. 1 ship. The forward scouts had laughed when they tagged it. They had named it, in their report, the Relic. The clerks in the counting room had laughed too. Senna did not laugh. She did not see the point, but she wrote the joke into the margin of her slate, because a clerk records everything, and she had learned long ago that the hegemony liked its records complete. The War Master of the Hand was a creature named Drovak, broad and slow and certain, and he came into the gallery to look at the muster pool with his own eyes. He stood beside Senna without greeting her, because she was a clerk and he was a War Master, and the gap between them was wider than the muster pool itself. He looked down at the 1,000 lights and made a low sound of approval in his chest. "Tell me the worst they have," he said. Senna read from her slate. 1,400 armed cargo vessels, War Master. Cutting lasers. Mining charges. Crews who have never held a line. And 1 military hull of unknown class, roughly 200,000 tons, drive cold, no active weapons signature, holding above the 3rd moon of their world. Holding, Drovak repeated. It has not moved in 40 days, War Master. The scouts believe it is a monument. A memorial ship. They say the blue world keeps old hulls the way some species keep bones. Drovak made the approving sound again. He liked the idea of a people who kept their dead ships in the sky where everyone could see them. It meant they remembered losing. It meant they were the kind of species that learned to lower its head. He told Senna to record that the blue world was a kneeling people who had merely forgotten, for 2 loud cycles, how to kneel, and that the Hand of 40 Suns had come to remind them. Senna recorded it. She was very good at recording things. Before the advance, there had been a council, and Senna had recorded it, because she recorded everything. The War Master had gathered his sub-commanders in the flag gallery and laid the campaign before them, and not one of them had argued, because there was nothing to argue. The blue world had no fleet. The blue world had 1 cold hull and a sky full of cargo haulers. The only question any sub-commander raised was how to divide the spoils of a world that could not defend itself, and Drovak had settled it in the manner of the hegemony, by tonnage and by seniority, and the council had ended in good humor. Senna had filled 4 slates with the division of a world that had not yet been touched, and she had not thought it strange, because the Vothan always counted the spoils before the fight. It was a sign of confidence. It was how you told a fleet it had already won. She had a junior under her in those days, a young clerk named Toll, eager and quick with a quill, and Toll had brought her the forward scouts report on the single hull with a grin on his face. He had read her the part about the relic, the dead monument the blue world kept in its sky, and he had laughed the easy laugh of a creature who had never seen a thing he could not count. Senna had not laughed. She had told Toll that a clerk does not laugh at an entry until the entry is closed, and Toll had thought she was being stern for the sake of sternness, and had filed the joke anyway, and Senna had let him, because the joke was, after all, what everyone believed. She thought of Toll, later, in the cold cabin 9 days into the dark. He had been in the counting room when the lights began to go out. She did not know what had become of him. There was no column for that. The order to advance went out across the muster pool, and the 1,000 lights began to move. They did not rush. The Vothan never rushed. They flowed forward in a wide curtain, layer behind layer, the heavy hulls in the center, and the converted haulers spread to the wings, and the whole formation slid toward the yellow star like a tide coming up a flat shore. Senna stayed in her gallery and kept the tally live, marking each hull as it crossed the muster line, because the hegemony wanted to know, to the exact ship, the size of the hand it had closed. It took 2 days to cross the dark between the muster point and the blue world. Senna slept in her chair and woke to numbers. The crossing was the part of any campaign she liked best, the long quiet hours when the fleet was a single clean column on her slate, and nothing had yet gone wrong, when every ship was still alive, and every plan still held, and the arithmetic of victory was still only arithmetic. She had crossed many darks this way, in the service of the hegemony, and every one of them had ended in a counted world and a clean record, and she had no reason, on this crossing, to think the pattern would break. The pattern had never broken. That was the whole of the Vothan's strength, and the whole of its blindness, and Senna, who had spent her life inside the pattern, could not yet see the edge of it any more than a creature inside a number can see the edge of the slate. On the first night of the crossing, the fleet channel carried a broadcast from the blue world, picked up by the forward scouts, and relayed back through the muster. It was one of the noise broadcasts, the words that had brought the hand of 40 suns across the dark, and Senna listened to it the way a clerk listens, for content rather than tone. The blue world was not pleading. That was the first thing she noted, and she noted it without weight, because a thing that does not plead before 1,000 ships is simply a thing that does not yet understand its situation. The blue world said, in the trade tongue, that it had no quarrel with the Vothan, that it wanted only to be left alone, and that it had said, from the first, exactly what it was, and that the hegemony had chosen not to believe it. The broadcast ended with a single sentence that Senna filed and did not think about again until it was far too late. The blue world said it would defend itself if it had to, and that it would only need to do so once. She slept after that, and woke to numbers, and the numbers said the fleet was strong and the enemy was nothing, and she believed the numbers, because the numbers had never lied to her. On the second day the forward scouts returned a closer scan of the single military hull, and she read it 3 times before she carried it up to the War Master, because something in it did not sit right against her clean columns. "The relic has woken," she said. Drovak did not look up from his maps. "Monuments do not wake. Its drive is warm, War Master. 40 days cold, and now warm. And the scan returns a name. The hull is broadcasting its own name on an open channel, slow, once every breath, in the trade tongue, so that anyone listening will hear it. What does the monument call itself?" Senna looked at the slate. The name had been carried on a clean carrier wave, repeated and repeated, patient as a heartbeat, across the whole closing dark, and every clerk in the counting room had heard it and written it down, and none of them had laughed this time. "It calls itself the last argument," she said. Drovak considered this, a monument that names itself an argument. He found it almost charming. He told Senna to record that the blue world, in its final hours, had chosen to speak instead of fight, and that the hand of 40 suns would answer the speech with silence, and the silence with fire. He was pleased with the line. He had her read it back twice. Then he gave the order, and 1,040 ships lit their attack drives at once, and the wide curtain of the hand of 40 suns swept the last dark and came down on the blue world like a closing fist. The single hull did not run. It did not hide behind its moon. It turned, slow and deliberate, presenting its full length to the oncoming fleet, and it kept broadcasting its name, once a breath, the last argument, the last argument, while 1,000 ships bore down on it from every angle at once. Senna watched the geometry of it on her slate. By the cold arithmetic of the muster pool, the single hull was already lost. It was outnumbered 1,040 to 1. It was outmassed by a number she had to use a second slate to write. It had no fleet, no wall, no second line. It had a name and a warm drive and a patient broadcast, and against the hand of 40 suns those things weighed exactly nothing. Senna wrote the outcome before it happened, because the hegemony liked its records complete and its conclusions early. She wrote that the single human hull was destroyed in the opening exchange. She left the time of destruction blank, to fill in when the scouts confirmed it. She was so certain of the line that her quill was already moving to the next entry. She never filled in that time. What happened instead is the thing the Vothan counting room would spend the rest of its short life trying not to record. Because the records had to be complete, and complete meant true, and the truth was that the single hull they had named a monument was not a monument at all. It was not even, in the sense the Vothan understood the word, a warship. It was something the blue world had built once, in a war the rest of the galaxy had never seen, and then set in the sky above its third moon, not as a memorial to a battle lost, but as a promise kept ready for a battle expected. The humans had not been keeping their dead ship where everyone could see it. They had been keeping their loaded one. Senna did not know any of that yet. She only knew, in the first moment after the fleets touched, that her clean columns had stopped meaning anything. She knew it the way a creature standing in a dry riverbed knows the sound that means the dam upstream has gone. She heard the counting room go quiet around her, every clerk frozen over a slate, and she looked down into the muster pool where the 1,000 friendly lights still burned, and she watched the first of them go out. Then she watched the second one go out, then the third, and the single hull above the blue world finished saying its name, one last time, slow and patient and clear, the last argument, and then it stopped talking, because it had nothing left to say that the Vothan would understand in words. The fourth light went out before Senna had finished writing down that the third was gone. She stopped trying to keep the tally live. There was no point in counting losses faster than her quill could move, and the losses were moving very fast now. She set down the master slate and simply watched the muster pool, which was the one thing a clerk was never supposed to do. A clerk recorded. A clerk did not stare. But the gallery had gone silent, and the War Master had gone still beside her, and the thing happening below them was not a battle in any shape the counting room had ever filed. The single hull had not charged the fleet. That was the first thing wrong. By every doctrine the Vothan had written across 900 conquests, a ship that was outnumbered, ran, or charged, because both bought time, and the single hull did neither. It held its position above the third moon, and let the hand of 40 suns come to it, the whole closing curtain of 1,000 ships, and it simply began to take them apart from the edges inward. Senna had expected fire. She had braced for the flat blue lances the Vothan heavy hulls used, or the bright bloom of mining charges going off in the dark. She got something quieter. The converted haulers on the leading wing did not explode. They went dark. One breath they were burning toward the blue world. Drives bright. Crews calling their approach across the fleet channel, and the next breath they were tumbling, cold, silent, their lights gone out as cleanly as a clerk wiping a slate. No flash, no debris, just a hull that had been a ship and was now a stone. "Report," Drovak said, and his voice had lost the slow certainty it had carried in the gallery. "What is it firing?" The reply came up scrambled from the leading hulls, layered with panic. Clerks and gunners and drive tenders all talking across one another. Senna did the thing she was best at. She sorted the noise. She pulled the threads apart and laid them in order, and what the order said was this. The single hull was not firing anything they could see. There was no beam, no charge, no projectile on any sensor the fleet carried. The ships of the leading wing were simply stopping. Their drives died. Their power died. Their crews, where the crews still spoke, reported every system gone dark at once, as if a hand had reached into each ship and closed it like a slate. Drovak refused this. He was a war master, and a war master did not accept that his ships were being switched off. He ordered the leading wing to volley, all of them at once, every cutting laser and every Vothan lance pointed at the single hull and fired together, so that the monument would drown in light and the counting room could go back to clean columns. The wing volleyed. Senna saw the muster pool flare as 400 weapons discharged in one breath. It was the largest single volley the Hand of 40 Suns had fired in 9 cycles of gathering, and it was aimed at one ship, 200,000 tons, against a fleet of millions, and by the arithmetic of her slates, it should have ended the engagement in that one flash. The flash reached the single hull and stopped. The counting room had a way of receiving battle, and the way was distance. The clerks watched lights in a pool and wrote numbers on slates, and the soldiers dying were never quite real to them, never more than a tally crossing the muster line. But the forward scouts had left a channel open to one of the leading heavy hulls, a ship called the Iron Patience, and that channel was still live in the gallery, and Senna heard, for the first time in her life, what a Vothan ship sounded like in the breath before it became a stone. She did not want to hear it. A clerk records what reaches her. The channel reached her, and so she recorded it. The captain of the Iron Patience was a creature she did not know, an old soldier by the steadiness of the voice, and he was calling clean reports across the channel the way a good captain does: drive nominal, weapons charged, range closing, the human hull dead ahead and not moving. He was certain. He had the same certainty the whole counting room had carried across the dark, and Senna heard the exact moment the certainty left him, because she heard him say, in a flat, puzzled tone, that his drive had stopped answering. Not failed, stopped. He said the helm had gone soft under his hands, and then he said the weapons would not fire, and then, with a wrongness in his voice that Senna would carry the rest of her life, he said that the power was draining out of his ship the way water drains out of a cracked jar, not blown out, not burned, simply leaving, as if his ship had been told quietly that it was no longer permitted to hold any. He did not panic. He was too old to panic. He asked, almost gently, what was doing this, and no one on the channel could tell him, and the last thing the captain of the Iron Patience said before his channel went dark with his ship was a single word, and the word was not a curse, and was not a prayer. The word was how. Senna wrote the word down. She titled nothing with it yet, but it lodged in her. The same question the War Master would ask her 2 watches later. The same question she would carry 9 days through the dark. The captain of the Iron Patience had died asking it, and Senna decided, in that moment, that someone in the Vothan record would answer it, because a question that good deserved a column, and the captain had paid for it with his ship. That was the second thing wrong, and it was worse than the first. Senna watched 400 weapons worth of fire close on the human ship and simply fail to land. It did not splash against a shield. The Vothan knew shields, owned shields, had broken 100 kinds of shield. This was not a shield. The fire reached a certain distance from the hull and ceased to exist, beam and charge and lance alike, swallowed without flare or scatter, as if the space around the human ship had been quietly told that fire was not allowed there, and the fire had agreed. The single hull did not even seem to strain. It took the largest volley of the campaign the way a clerk takes a single slate, glanced at it, and set it aside. And then it answered. Senna would spend a long time, afterward, trying to describe what the answer was, because she had been trained her whole life to describe things, and this thing slid out from under every word she owned. It was not a beam, it was a kind of reaching. The single hull turned a part of itself toward the leading wing, and along a line drawn straight through 400 ships. Every one of those ships went dark at once. Not destroyed, not burned, dark. 400 lights in the muster pool blinked out together in the space of a single breath, and the counting room made a sound Senna had never heard a counting room make, a low collective groan, as 400 clean entries became 400 blanks. She picked up the master slate again. Her hands had decided, on their own, that the situation needed recording after all. She wrote the number. 411 hulls dark in the opening exchange. She wrote it small and tight, the way clerks wrote things they did not want to be true. The War Master was no longer slow. He moved through the gallery snapping orders, and the orders were good orders, the orders of a creature who had won 900 fights. He pulled the wings back. He bunched the fleet tight, because a tight formation could mass its fire and overwhelm a single point, and a single point was all the human hull was. He brought the heavy hulls up from the center, the real warships, the ones that had cracked planets, and he formed them into a fist around the converted haulers so that the soft ships would not break the fleet's nerve. He did everything right. Senna recorded all of it, because it was good doctrine, and good doctrine deserved a clean record even when it was about to fail. It failed. The single hull let the fist form. It waited, patient, the way it had waited 40 days above its moon, and when the hand of 40 suns had drawn itself tight into a hard mass of hulls, the human ship moved for the first time. It did not charge the fist. It slid sideways, along the long axis of the fleet, keeping its distance, presenting that same full length it had shown from the first breath, and as it moved it reached again, and a line of darkness followed it through the Vothan formation like a finger drawn through dust. Wherever the line passed, ships went dark. Senna watched it travel. It moved through the bunched fleet at a steady, unhurried pace, and the heavy hulls in its path lit every weapon they had and threw everything into the space ahead of it, and the space ahead of it ate the fire and kept the darkness coming. The fist the War Master had made was the best target the human ship could have asked for. 1,000 ships pressed together meant 1,000 ships the single line could touch without traveling far. The doctrine that had cracked planets had handed the human hull a stationary mass and a clean approach. Drovak did not give up on doctrine all at once. A War Master who had won 900 fights had a deep well of tricks, and he reached into it. He had read, in the old reports, that the human reach seemed to need a clear line, that the finger of darkness traveled in a straight path through the formation, and so he tried to break the line. He ordered 100 converted haulers to throw themselves between the human ship and the heavy hulls, a wall of soft bodies meant to soak the reach and buy the real warships room to mass their fire. It was a cruel order and a clever one, and in any fight the Vothan had ever fought it would have worked, because 100 ships in the way is 100 ships the enemy must chew through first. The human hull did not chew through them. It reached past them. Senna watched the wall of haulers form, watched the heavy hulls behind it begin to charge their lances in the bought room, and then watched the finger of darkness arrive, not at the wall but past it, threading between the soft hulls without touching them, finding the heavy hulls behind, and switching them off one by one, while the wall of haulers floated untouched in front of the corpses of the ships they had been ordered to protect. The last argument had looked at the cruel, clever order and declined it. It did not want the soft crews. It wanted the guns. It had reached over the heads of the creatures the War Master had spent and taken only the ships that could kill, and it had left the wall alive to watch. Drovak saw it. Senna watched him see it, watched the certainty go out of him the way the lights were going out of the muster pool, and to his credit he did not freeze. He scattered the fleet again, threw the formation wide, sent the surviving hulls fleeing in every direction, so that the single line could not catch more than a few at a time. It was the right call. It was, Senna would later think, the only call left, and it bought the hand of 40 suns exactly the time it took the human hull to understand that the fleet had stopped pretending to be a fleet, and had become, instead, a scattering of frightened single ships, which was a much easier thing to count. The counting room around her was coming apart, and Senna recorded that too, because it was the truest record of what 1,000 ships becoming nothing does to the creatures who counted them. The clerks who had filled the muster slates with such confidence were filling them now with blanks, and a slate full of blanks is a hard thing for a clerk to hold, because a blank is a question the record cannot answer, and a counting room exists to answer questions. Some of the clerks had stopped writing. Senna saw one of them, an old tally keeper she had worked beside for many cycles, simply set down her quill and stare at the muster pool with her mouth open, and Senna understood the look, because it was the look of a creature watching the one thing she had always believed in fail in front of her. The Vothan believed in numbers the way other species believed in gods, and the clerks of the counting room were watching their god die in a muster pool, light by light, and it was breaking something in them that no amount of clean columns would ever set right. Drovak had stopped giving orders. There was nothing left to order. He stood at the rail of the gallery and watched the fewer than 400 surviving lights flee in every direction, and Senna watched him, because the War Master's face was a record too, and someone had to keep it. She had expected rage or denial, and she had seen both pass across him earlier. What she saw now was neither. It was the flat, hollowed look of a creature doing arithmetic it does not want to finish, and she knew the arithmetic, because she was doing it herself. The War Master was counting how many ships he had lost, and how many remained, and how long it would take the single human hull to finish the remainder, and the answer to the last sum was not long, and his face was the face of a creature reading that answer and finding no place to file it. He turned, once, and looked at Senna, and for a breath, the gap between a War Master and a clerk closed, because they were both, now, only creatures watching the same impossible thing. He did not say anything. He did not have to. The look said it. The look said you were right not to laugh, and Senna, who had told a junior clerk 3 days ago that you do not laugh at an entry until it is closed, found no satisfaction in being right, because the entry that was closing was everything she had ever served. She bent over her slate and did the arithmetic anyway, because she could not stop. 1,040 ships at the muster line, 411 dark in the opening exchange, 260 more in the second reaching, when the line walked through the fist. The fleet that had crossed the dark certain of its size was, in the space of perhaps 40 breaths, down to fewer than 400 hulls, and the single hull above the blue world had not taken a single mark, not one. It hung there exactly as it had hung for 40 days, 200,000 tons of patient metal, and it had not lost a panel. Senna set down her quill. She looked at the line she had written in the gallery 2 days before, the line the War Master had been so pleased with, the line about answering the speech with silence, and the silence with fire. She had recorded it twice at his request. She looked at it now and understood that the counting room had got the whole shape of the thing backward. They had thought the silence was theirs to give. They had thought the human ship was the one that would be made quiet. She raised her head and looked at the muster pool, where the surviving lights of the Hand of 40 Suns were fleeing in every direction across the dark, and she said, quietly, to no one, because a clerk speaks the truth even when no one wants it recorded, we are the noise. No one answered her. The War Master was bent over his maps, trying to make a war out of the wreck of one. The clerks around her were filling blanks where ships used to be. But Senna had said the true thing, and the slate had heard it, and that was enough for a clerk. We are the noise, she thought. We crossed the dark to make a quiet world quiet, and the quiet world sent one ship to make us quiet instead, and it is doing it the way we meant to do it, calmly, completely, without raising its voice. She thought, in that moment, of the council before the muster, of the 4 slates she had filled with the division of a world that could not defend itself, of the good humor in the flag gallery as the sub-commanders argued tonnage. The Vothan had counted the spoils of the blue world before a single shot was fired, because that was a sign of confidence, because that was how you told a fleet it had already won. And the spoils were still uncounted, and the fleet that had been promised them was a drift of cold stones, and the blue world had not lost a panel. Senna thought of those 4 slates, and understood that they were the truest portrait of her people she had ever drawn, a fleet so certain of its own size that it had divided a world it had not touched, sent by a counting room so certain of its numbers that it had filed 3 plain warnings under boasting. The spoils slates were still in the archive. They would have to be marked void. She wondered who would do it. She wondered if there would be anyone left who cared to keep the record clean. She found, to her own surprise, that she was no longer afraid for the fleet. The fleet was already gone. It had been gone since the 4th light. What she felt instead was a clerk's cold curiosity, the thing that had kept her in the counting room her whole life, and it asked a single question and would not let go of it. How? Not why the human ship was winning. The why was obvious now. The why was that the Vothan had brought numbers to a fight that numbers did not decide. But how? How did one hull, with no fleet behind it, switch off ships from a distance and eat the largest volley of the campaign without a flicker? What had the blue world built, and set in its sky, and named the last argument, and kept warm and ready for the day a tide came up its shore? She started a new slate. She titled it, in her own small hand, with a word the hegemony did not have a column for. She titled it The Question, and she began, in the middle of the worst defeat the counting room had ever filed, to do the only thing she knew how to do well, which was to find out the truth and write it down, even if the truth was the last thing the Vothan record would ever hold. The forward scouts, the same scouts who had laughed and named the hull the Relic, were the ones who gave her the first piece. They had been holding at the edge of the engagement, recording, because the hegemony liked its records complete, and they had captured something in the first exchange that no one in the panic had stopped to read. They sent it up to the gallery flagged as anomalous, which was a scout's polite word for a thing that frightened them. It was a single transmission, pulled out of the human hull's broadcast in the breath before it stopped saying its name. It was not in any of the 9 languages the blue world had been using. It was in the trade tongue, slow and clear, meant to be understood, and it said only this: "We told you what we are. You wrote it down and you laughed. The fault is in your record, not in us." Senna read it 3 times. Then she did something a Vothan clerk had perhaps never done in the long history of the counting room. She went back into the archive, into the old entries, the ones from before the muster, and she pulled the forward scout's very first report on the blue world, the one filed 2 cycles ago when the noise had started, and she read every line of it looking for the place where the record had gone wrong. She found it fast, because she was good. It was right there in the second paragraph, in a sentence the muster clerks had skimmed because it was inconvenient and the column it belonged in was already full. The blue world had said, in its very first broadcast, in plain trade tongue, that it had fought a war the rest of the galaxy had never seen, against an enemy that came in numbers, the way the Vothan came in numbers, and that it had won that war with a single ship, and that it had kept that ship. The blue world had said this openly. It had said it first. The Vothan had heard it, and filed it under boasting, and stamped the boast not credible, and moved 1,040 ships into range of a thing it had been warned about in plain words. The fault is in your record, not in us. Senna closed the old report. She understood, now, why the human ship had been so patient, why it had waited 40 days, why it had broadcast its name slow and clear across the closing dark. It had not been afraid, and it had not been bluffing, and it had not been a monument forgotten in the sky. It had been giving the Hand of 40 Suns every chance to read its own records correctly and turn around. The humans had warned them in the first broadcast. They had warned them again in the name of the ship. They had warned them a 3rd time, that single transmission, in the breath before the killing began. 3 warnings, slow and clear, in the trade tongue, recorded and filed and laughed at. The Vothan had counted 1,000 ways to win, and had not, in any of them, counted the possibility that the enemy had told the truth. Senna carried the old report up to the War Master, because that was her duty, and because a clerk who has found the place where the record went wrong is obligated to show it to the one who can still act on it. She laid the slate in front of Drovak and read him the 2nd paragraph, the one about the war the galaxy had never seen and the single ship that had won it. She watched the War Master's broad face as the words went in, and she saw, for the first time, a Vothan War Master look at a number and understand that he had been beaten before he ever crossed the dark. He did not rage. That surprised her. He looked at the slate for a long moment, and then he looked at the muster pool, at the fewer than 400 lights still fleeing, and he asked her one question, the same question she had titled her own slate with. "How does it do it?" he said. "One hull, no fleet. How?" And Senna, quill master of the Vothan tide, who had spent her whole life inside numbers that never lied, answered him with the only honest thing she had. "I don't know yet, War Master," she said, "but I am going to find out, and I am going to write it down, because someone in the hegemony has to know what 1,000 ships are not enough for. And I think the only place left to learn it is over there. She pointed across the gallery, across the muster pool, across the fleeing lights and the dark between, to the single patient hull above the third moon of the blue world. The hull that the Vothan had named the Relic, and the humans had named the Last Argument, and that had not, in all of this, lost so much as a single panel. The thing about a clerk is that she cannot stop wanting the column filled, even when the column is killing everyone she knows. Senna got her chance to learn the truth in a way she had not asked for and could not have arranged. The War Master, after he understood that the Hand of 40 Suns was already lost, made the last good decision of his career. He could not save the fleet. He could perhaps save knowledge. So he ordered a single fast scout, the smallest hull left, to break away from the scattering and run for the deep dark, carrying every record the counting room had filed since the engagement began, so that the hegemony would at least know what had killed its 1,000 ships. And he put his Quillmaster aboard it, because the records meant nothing without someone who could read them, and Senna was the only one left who had already started asking how. She did not want to go. She wanted to stay and count to the end, because that was a clerk's place. But the War Master told her that a record no one survives to read is not a record, it is a tomb, and the Vothan did not build tombs, they built archives. So she went. The scout broke from the dying fleet and ran, and Senna watched the muster pool shrink on her slate as the distance grew, the last few hundred lights flickering out one by one behind her, and she did the arithmetic she had been avoiding. Of 1,040 ships, the Last Argument had darkened all but the one she rode, and a handful too scattered to count. It had done it in less than a single watch. It had done it without losing a panel. And it had done it, she now believed, while trying its best to make the killing clean, because the converted haulers it switched off were not destroyed, they were only stopped, their crews alive in cold hulls drifting above the blue world, waiting to be collected by a people who, it turned out, did not believe in killing what they did not have to. That was the detail that broke the last of Senna's certainty about who the Vothan had come to conquer. The human ship could have burned every hauler to gas. It had the reach. It had eaten 400 weapons worth of fire without a flicker, so it plainly had power to spare. And it had chosen, ship by ship, to switch the soft crews off and leave them whole, while it took apart only the hulls that carried real guns. A species that fought like that was not a kneeling people who had forgotten how to kneel. It was a people who had decided, a long time ago, exactly how much killing a thing was worth, and had built one ship that could deliver precisely that amount, and not a gram more. Senna wrote that down. It was the truest line she had filed all day. The scout ran for 9 days, and Senna spent every waking hour of them inside the records, because the War Master had given her a tomb to turn into an archive, and she meant to do it. She pulled apart every transmission the counting room had captured. She cross-read the human ship's slow broadcasts against the old scout reports. She reconstructed the geometry of the darkening line, breath by breath, hull by hull, until she could trace exactly how the Last Argument had walked its finger of darkness through the Vothan fist. And slowly, the way truth comes to a patient clerk, the how began to take shape. It was not magic, though it had felt like magic in the gallery. It was a kind of weapon the Vothan had no column for, because the Vothan had never imagined building it. The human hull did not throw energy at a target. It reached into a target and unmade the agreement that let the target work. Every Vothan ship ran on a drive that obeyed certain rules, the same rules the converted haulers used, the same rules the heavy hulls used, the same rules every ship in the galaxy used, because they were the rules of the universe. The Last Argument reached across the dark and, for a single hull at a time, quietly suspended those rules. Inside the reach, a drive could not turn, a weapon could not fire, power could not flow, the ship did not break. It simply stopped being allowed to be a ship, for as long as the human hull cared to hold it, and a ship that is not allowed to be a ship is a stone. Senna understood, reading it, why the human broadcast had said the fault was in the Vothan record. The hand of 40 suns had counted hulls and guns and tonnage, all the things a record could hold, and it had never once thought to count the thing the last argument was actually built to attack, which was not the fleet's bodies but its permission to exist. 1,000 ships and 1,000,000 guns all depended on the same handful of rules. The human ship did not need to defeat 1,000 ships. It needed to defeat the rules, one ship at a time, and the rules were the same everywhere, so the 1,000th ship was no harder than the first. There was a deeper layer under that, and Senna found it on the 5th day, and it frightened her more than anything she had filed yet. She had assumed, in the gallery, that the human ship reached into each Vothan hull from outside, finding it across the dark and switching it off the way a hand finds a candle. But the geometry did not support that. The darkening had not radiated from the human ship like light from a star. It had propagated, the way a crack travels through stone, the way a word passes through a crowd, each darkened ship seeming to make the next one easier. The weapon had not attacked the fleet from outside. It had spread through it from within, using the fleet's own connectedness against it, the drives and the channels and the shared rules that bound 1,000 hulls into one fleet. The Vothan had massed their ships tight for strength, and the tightness had been the road the weapon traveled. Senna wrote that down with a hand that was not quite steady, because she understood, writing it, that this was the truth the hegemony would refuse hardest of all. A larger fleet was not a stronger answer to the human ship. A larger fleet was a longer road. 10,000 hulls massed tight would not overwhelm the reach. They would carry it faster, the thing the Vothan called strength, the great connected tide of hulls all running on the same rules, was the exact thing the last argument had been built to ride, and the more the Vothan brought, the more there was to turn against them. The Blue World had not built a ship that beat fleets. It had built a ship that made a fleet's own size into the weapon that unmade it. She titled that entry, too, with a word the hegemony had no column for. She titled it, The Road, and she set it beside the question, and she knew that between the two of them, they held the whole shape of the thing, and that the whole shape was an obituary for the Vothan idea of war. That was the answer to how. One hull beat 1,000 because the 1,000 were all, secretly, the same ship wearing different numbers, and the human hull had been built to beat that one ship as many times as the dark required. There was more in the records than the how, and Senna found it on the 7th day, when she had stopped expecting to find anything and was only reading because reading was the one thing that kept the cold cabin from closing in. Buried in the human ship's slow broadcasts, underneath the name and the warnings, there was a second carrier, very faint, that the counting room had logged as noise and never decoded. Senna decoded it. It took her most of the 7th day. It was not aimed at the Vothan. It was not aimed at anyone. It was a thing the human ship did, apparently, all the time, the way a heart beats whether or not anyone is listening, and what it carried was a list. The list was names, ship names, in the human tongue, rendered also in trade so that any listener could read them, hundreds of them, thousands, scrolling slow and patient under everything else the last argument said. Senna read them for a long while before she understood what she was reading, and when she understood, she set down her quill and did not pick it up again for some time, which was, for her, a kind of weeping. They were the human dead, the ship names of a war the galaxy had never seen. The last argument carried them on a quiet channel beneath its own voice, a roll of every hull the Blue World had lost in the 100-year burying it had spoken of in its first broadcast, and it spoke them endlessly, into the dark, whether or not a fight was happening, whether or not anyone could hear. Senna counted as far as she could before the list looped, and she lost the exact number, but it was not hundreds. It was tens of thousands. The Blue World had lost tens of thousands of ships once, in a war it had fought as a tide against a tide, and it carried the names of all of them under the voice of the single ship it had built afterward, so that the one ship that never lost a panel, never for a breath forgot the price of the war that had taught it not to need a fleet. Senna understood, reading the roll, why the human ship had been so unhurried, so patient, so unwilling to kill what it did not have to. It was not patient because it was powerful. It was patient because it remembered. A people who carry the names of tens of thousands of their own dead under the voice of their last ship do not switch on a hauler full of soldiers gladly. They do it only when a tide forces the argument, and they leave alive everyone they can, because they have a list already, and they do not want to add to it, not even with the names of their enemies. She added that to her record. It did not belong in any Vothan column. She made a new one. Senna filed the answer. It was the best work of her life, and it was an obituary for everything she had ever served. She sat with it for a long while, in the small, cold cabin of the fleeing scout, and she let herself feel the thing a clerk is not supposed to feel, which is the weight of the truth she had just written down. The Vothan hegemony had conquered 900 worlds by being the largest number in every room it entered. It had built its whole civilization on the certainty that no enemy could field a number it could not beat. And one blue world, with one ship, had reached into that certainty and switched it off, the way the last argument switched off a hauler, calmly and completely, and without raising its voice. The Vothan had never been beaten before, because they had never met an enemy who did not agree to play the game of numbers. The humans had refused the game. They had built a single ship that made the game irrelevant, and then they had told the Vothan, in plain trade tongue, 3 separate times, that this was what they had done, and the Vothan had filed the warning under boasting and stamped it not credible. On the 9th day, the scout reached the relay at the edge of Vothan space, the great listening station that fed the counting rooms of the hegemony, and Senna prepared to transmit her archive inward, to the worlds that did not yet know that 1,000 ships had become blanks above a blue star. She had the how, and the where it had gone wrong, and the obituary for the certainty her people had lived on. She had done her duty. She had turned a tomb into an archive. And then the relay's own sensors woke and told her that the last argument was already there. It had not chased her. That was the part Senna could not, at first, make fit. The scout had run for 9 days at its best speed, and a chase would have been a long, stern race, and there had been no race, because the human hull had not followed. It had simply arrived, hanging in the dark beside the Vothan relay, patient, full length, exactly as it had hung above its moon. It had got there first. It had known where the last scout would run, because there was only one relay at the edge of Vothan space, and only one place a fleeing record could go, and it had been waiting at the obvious door for 9 days, the way it had waited above its moon for 40. Senna sat very still in her cold cabin and understood the last piece of the truth, the piece the how had not covered. The human ship was not trying to kill the scout. If it had wanted the scout dead, the scout would already be a stone. It had come to the relay for the same reason it had broadcast its name slow and clear across the closing dark. It had come to make sure the record got home. The transmission opened on its own. The last argument reached into the relay the way it reached into everything, gently, and it did not switch the relay off. It used it, and a voice came through into Senna's cabin, slow and clear, in the trade tongue, the same patient cadence the ship had used to say its own name, and it spoke to her directly, because it knew, somehow, that the one creature left who mattered was the clerk. "Quillmaster," it said. "Finish your record." Senna did not answer right away. A clerk does not answer until she knows what she is recording. "You ran 9 days to carry a true thing home," the voice said. "I will not stop you. I want the thing carried. Your hegemony needs to read it correctly this time. So finish it, and add the part you have not written yet, because it is the part that matters most." "What part?" Senna said. Her voice did not shake. She was a little proud of that. "The part where you tell them why you are still alive," the human ship said. 1,040 ships came to make my world quiet. I darkened all but a handful. I let the soft crews live, and I let your scout run, and I am letting you transmit. Your record will say I am unbeatable, and that is true, but it is the small truth. Write the large one. Write that I let you go on purpose. Write that the blue world does not want your 1,000 worlds. Write that we built one ship that can switch off any number you can ever field, and that we have kept it warm above our moon for longer than your hegemony has existed, and that we have never once used it on anyone who did not first cross the dark to make us kneel. Write all of that, Quillmaster, and then add the only line that will keep the next 1,000 ships home. Senna waited. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the last argument hung in the dark. 200,000 tons of patient metal that had unmade a fleet and had not lost a panel, and it was, she realized, asking her to write its mercy into the Vothan archive so that the mercy would not be needed twice. "What line?" she said, and the human ship told her, slow and clear, and Senna picked up her quill, because she was a clerk, and a clerk writes the true thing even when the true thing is the end of everything she thought her people were. The line the human ship gave her was 11 words long, and Senna did not transmit it. Not at first. A clerk who has spent her life filing other people's certainties does not simply accept a sentence handed to her across the dark, even by a ship that has just unmade a fleet. She held the 11 words in her cabin, and she did the thing she always did, which was to test them against the record, because a line is only true if the record will bear it. The line was this: "Count us once, and you will never need to count us again." Senna read it as a clerk reads everything, looking for the place where it would fail, and she could not find one. She laid it against every number she had carried out of the gallery. 1,040 ships at the muster line, 411 dark in the opening exchange, 260 in the second reaching, the rest scattered and switched off, hull by hull, while the single human ship took no mark at all. The line held. The hegemony had counted the humans once, in the very first scout report 2 cycles ago, and had counted them wrong, and 1,000 ships had paid for the error. "Count us once and count us right," the line meant, "and you will understand that there is no number that beats us, and so you will never need to send a number again." It was not a threat. That was the thing that kept Senna still in her cabin for a long while. A threat said, "Do this or suffer." The human line said something stranger and harder. It said, "Look at the truth, and you will not need to suffer at all." The blue world did not want the Vothan 1,000 worlds. It had said so, in the first broadcast, in plain trade tongue. It had only ever wanted to be left quiet. And the last argument was not a sword the humans were holding to the hegemony's throat. It was a door the humans were holding open, and the 11 words were the sign hung over the door, and the sign said, "You do not have to come through here again." Senna understood, finally, what the human ship had meant when it called itself an argument. An argument is not a war. An argument is a thing you can win by being right, and the blue world had decided, a very long time ago, to win this one by being right, and to keep one ship warm above its moon for as long as it took for someone to cross the dark and force the argument to its end. The Vothan had come to make a quiet world quiet. The quiet world had answered with the only argument a tide could not drown, which was a single ship that made the size of the tide stop mattering. She picked up her quill. She did not just transmit the 11 words. She was a quill master of the Vothan tide, and she gave the hegemony the whole record, because a line without its record is a boast, and the humans had been filed under boasting once already, and 1,000 ships had died of it. So she transmitted everything: the muster of 1,040, the first scout report, and the second paragraph the muster clerks had skimmed. The 3 warnings, slow and clear, in the trade tongue. The how, reconstructed breath by breath, the weapon that did not break ships but unmade their permission to be ships. The mercy, the soft crews left alive in cold hulls above the blue world. The scout let run, the relay used and not switched off. And at the end of it, in its proper column, the 11 words: "Count us once, and you will never need to count us again." She transmitted it inward, to the counting rooms of the hegemony, to the worlds that still believed they were the largest number in every room. And when it was sent, when the archive was safe and home and could not be unfiled, Senna sat back in her cold cabin and waited for the human ship to switch off the scout, because she had served her purpose now, and she was, after all, Vothan, and the Vothan had come to kill. The last argument did not switch off the scout. "It is done," the human ship said, in its slow, clear voice. "The record is home. Read correctly this time. That is all we ever asked." "You are letting me live," Senna said. It was not a question. She was a clerk. She was confirming an entry. "I am letting the record live," the ship said. "You are the record. The two are the same thing now. A hegemony that counts by numbers needs one creature who counts the truth, and you are the only one of those your people have left, because the rest of them are still in the gallery, learning that numbers do not save you. Go home, Quill Master. Tell them what 1,000 ships are not enough for. Tell them the blue world is quiet, and wants to stay quiet, and has exactly one ship, and that the one ship is enough, and that the kindest thing the Vothan can do for the Vothan is never make it prove that again." Senna looked out of her cabin at the patient hull in the dark, and she asked the thing she had wanted to ask since the fourth light went out, the question that was not in any Vothan column and never would be. "Why keep one ship?" she said. "Why not build 1,000, if one can do this? Why not match us tide for tide and bury us? You have the weapon. You could be the largest number in every room there is. You could be us, but more." And the human ship was quiet for a moment, the first time it had been quiet since it stopped saying its name, and when it answered, the slow, clear voice had something underneath it that Senna, who had spent her life reading the underneath of things, recognized as grief. "Because we were the largest number once," the last argument said. "In the war the galaxy never saw. We came in tides too, Quill Master, a long time ago, against an enemy that came in tides, and we matched them ship for ship and world for world, and we buried each other for 100 years, and at the end there was almost nothing left of either of us to bury. And the few of us who lived through it looked at the field of it and made a decision. We decided we would never again win by being the larger tide. We decided we would build one ship that made the size of a tide stop mattering, and we would keep it warm above our home, and we would never use it on anyone who did not first cross the dark to make us kneel. One ship, not 1,000, because 1,000 is how you become the thing you fought, and we have buried enough of ourselves to know we never want to be that thing again." "I found the list," Senna said. She had not meant to say it. It came out of her the way truth comes out of a clerk who has held a thing too heavy too long. "The names, under your voice, the ones you carry." The human ship was quiet for a breath. "You decoded it," it said. "Few do, fewer try." "Tens of thousands," Senna said. "Your own dead. From the war the galaxy never saw. You carry them everywhere, all the time, whether anyone listens or not." "We do." "Why?" Senna said, and she meant it as a clerk means it. She wanted the column filled. A ship that cannot be beaten does not need to mourn. You could carry a battle hymn. You could carry your victories. You carry a roll of the lost instead, under everything, forever. Why? Because a weapon that cannot be beaten is the most dangerous thing a people can own, the last argument said, and the grief was plain in the slow, clear voice now, no longer underneath it. A people who hold an unbeatable thing forget, very quickly, why they built it. They start to use it for small reasons. They start to count, the way your hegemony counts, and they become the tide they swore off. So we built the names into the ship. I cannot fire without speaking them. I cannot switch off a single hull of yours without the roll of my own dead running under my voice the whole time. It is not mourning, Quill Master. It is a leash. It is the blue world, reminding the blue world, in every breath of every battle, what it costs to win by being the larger number, so that we never, not once, switch on a ship for a reason smaller than a tide crossing the dark to make us kneel. The list is not grief. The list is restraint, written into the one ship that could otherwise be the end of everyone. There was one more thing Senna had to understand before she could write the record well, and she asked the human ship for it, because the ship had answered everything else. She asked how long it had hung above its moon, not the 40 days the scouts had logged, the whole of it. How long the blue world had kept its single hull warm and waiting in the sky. "Longer than your hegemony has had a name," the last argument said, and Senna had heard the phrase before, in the gallery, but she had taken it for a figure of speech. It was not a figure of speech. The ship gave her the number, and the number was so large that Senna had to write it across 2 slates the way she had written the outmass at the start of the battle, and she sat with it for a long time. The Blue World had built this ship and set it above its moon before the first Vothan world was conquered. Before the hegemony existed, it had hung there, warm, loaded, patient, through the entire rise of an empire that conquered 900 worlds and never once thought to wonder what the quiet blue world in the corner of the rim was keeping ready. The hegemony had been born, and grown, and reached the height of its strength, and crossed the dark with 1,000 ships, all in the span of a single ship's weight. "You were waiting for us," Senna said. "Before we existed, you were already waiting." "Not for you," the human ship said. "For a tide, any tide. We did not know it would be the Vothan, and we did not need to know. We knew only that the galaxy makes tides, that sooner or later a people grows large enough to believe its size is a law, and that when it does, it will look at a quiet world and read the quiet as weakness and cross the dark to make us kneel. We have seen it before. We were a tide once ourselves, so we built the answer, and we kept it warm, and we waited, because the answer is only worth keeping if it is ready on the day the tide finally comes. Your hegemony was the tide. It could have been anyone. It is always, eventually, someone. The ship does not wait for an enemy, Quillmaster. It waits for the mistake, and the mistake always comes. Senna wrote that down, and it went cold in her, because it was the thing that turned the whole campaign from a defeat into something older and sadder. The Vothan had not been ambushed. They had not stumbled into a trap. They had walked, of their own certainty, into the exact place a patient people had been holding open for an empire that did not yet exist when the holding began. The Blue World had not been keeping a monument in its sky. It had been keeping an appointment, and the hand of 40 suns had crossed the dark, 1,040 ships strong, to keep it. Senna wrote that down too. She would remember it as the moment she understood the Blue World completely, the moment the last alien thing about them resolved into something she could almost have built herself, if her people had ever buried enough of themselves to learn it. The humans had not made a perfect weapon and trusted themselves to use it well. They had made a perfect weapon and assumed they would use it badly, and had chained it to their own dead so that they could not. They did not believe in their own goodness. They believed in their own memory, and they had made the memory load-bearing. Senna wrote it down. Of course she wrote it down. It was the truest line in the entire record, truer than the how, truer than the 11 words, and it was the one the hegemony would have the hardest time reading correctly, because it was a thing the Vothan had no column for. The Blue World had been a tide once. It had buried itself learning what a tide costs. And it had chosen, out of that grave, not power but restraint, not 1,000 ships but one, not conquest but a quiet world, and a single argument kept warm for anyone foolish enough to need it answered. The Vothan had crossed the dark to teach the humans how to kneel. The humans had already learned, long ago, the one lesson kneeling teaches, which is what it costs to make someone else kneel, and they had built their single ship as a promise, never to teach that lesson to anyone who did not insist on learning it. "Go home, Quillmaster," the last argument said. "Carry the record, and when your hegemony reads it, and panics, and starts to build a tide of its own to come and finish what the hand of 40 suns began, you will be the one in the counting room who has seen the end of that math. You will be the one who can stand in the gallery and say the 11 words. That is why you are alive. Not because I am merciful, because the record needs a reader, and the reader needs to have stood close enough to the truth to be unable to file it under boasting." The human ship's drive warmed. Senna watched it on her slate, the same warm signature the scouts had seen above the third moon, and she understood that it was going home, back to its quiet world, back to its waiting place above the moon, where it would hang for another 40 years, or another 400, until the next tide came up the next shore and forced the argument to its end again. "One more thing," Senna said, because she was a clerk and a clerk closes every entry. "The crews, the soft crews you switched off and left alive in their cold hulls above your world. What becomes of them?" "They wake," the last argument said. "We warm their hulls and we wake them, and we tell them, in plain trade tongue, what they crossed the dark to do, and we send them home, every one of them, because they are the record too, Quillmaster, the same as you. 1,040 ships came to make us quiet, and we want every soldier who lived to carry the same line home that you are carrying. Count us once. Never need to count us again. The more of you who say it, the longer it stays true, and the longer it stays true, the longer everyone gets to live, including us. Mercy is not weakness, clerk. Mercy is the cheapest way to never have to do this twice. And then the human ship turned, slow and deliberate, presenting its full length one last time the way it had from the very first breath, and it slid away into the dark, toward the yellow star and the blue world and the patient place above the moon, and it was gone, and it had not, in all of this, in the unmaking of 1,000 ships, and the sparing of their crews, and the saving of one clerk and one record, lost so much as a single panel. Senna sat alone in the cold scout at the edge of Vothan space, beside the relay that had carried her archive home, and she did the last arithmetic of the campaign. 1,040 ships sent, one ship met, one ship enough, and against that, the count on the other side, 0 panels lost, 0 crews killed who could be left alive, 1 scout spared, 1 clerk spared, 1 record carried home, on purpose, by an enemy who wanted, more than it wanted to win, for the winning to never be necessary again. She titled the final entry. She did not call it a defeat, though it was the worst defeat in the history of the counting room. She did not call it a battle, though 1,000 ships had gone dark in it. She looked for a long time at the empty column where the title belonged, and then she wrote the only word that the record would bear, the word the human ship had given itself, the word that was not a war because it could be won by being right. She titled it The Argument, and underneath it, in her own small careful hand, she wrote the line she had carried 9 days to bring home, and she knew, writing it, that it would either save her people or be the last thing any of them ever read. Count us once and you will never need to count us again. The hegemony read the record the way the human ship had feared it would, and it panicked, and it built a tide. Senna had known it would. She had carried the archive home herself, transmitted it inward through the relay, then ridden the scout the long way back to the central counting world to deliver it in person, because a record read aloud by the one who lived it cannot be filed under boasting as easily as one that arrives on its own. She stood in the great gallery of the hegemony, the largest counting room in 900 conquered worlds, and she told the assembled quill masters and war masters and tally lords everything, the muster of 1,040, the how, the mercy, the 11 words. She told it plainly and completely, the way a clerk tells the truth, and she watched the largest minds of her people listen to the end of the math their civilization was built on. And then they did exactly what the last argument had predicted. They did not read the 11 words as a door held open. They read them as a wound to be answered. A single human ship had unmade 1,000 Vothan hulls, and the hegemony's whole certainty depended on no enemy fielding a number it could not beat, and so the only answer the counting rooms could imagine was a larger number. If 1,000 ships were not enough, send 10,000. If one human ship could darken 1,000, then 10,000 Vothan hulls would overwhelm its reach by sheer count, because the reach had to have a limit. Everything had a limit, and a large enough tide would find it. Senna stood in the gallery and watched them decide this, and she did the thing she had been kept alive to do. She walked to the center of the counting room, to the place where only tally lords stood, and she said, in the plain, clear voice she had learned from a ship across the dark, that the math they were about to do had already been done, by her, 9 days running in a cold cabin, and that it ended the same way every time. She told them the human ship did not need to beat 1,000 ships, or 10,000, because the 1,000 and the 10,000 were all the same ship wearing different numbers, all running on the same rules. The last argument unmade one hull at a time. She told them a larger tide was not a harder problem for the human weapon. It was only a longer afternoon. The reach had no limit they could outcount, because the thing it reached for was not the bodies of the ships, but the permission underneath them, and the permission was the same in the first hull and the 10,000th. The tally lords did not want to hear it. Of course they did not. She was a clerk, and they were tally lords, and the gap between them was wider than the muster pool. But Senna had stood close enough to the truth to be unable to file it under boasting, and that was exactly why the human ship had spared her, and she found, standing in the center of the great gallery, that she could not be made to file it under boasting now either. So she gave them the record, the whole thing, and she let them read it, and she waited. They built the tide anyway. Before they built it, the spared crews came home. This was the thing Senna had not expected, and it was the thing that nearly stopped the tide before it began. The human ship had kept its word. Every soft crew it had switched off above the blue world, the haulers and the wall and the drone bellies, all of them. It had warmed and woken and told, in plain trade tongue, exactly what they had crossed the dark to do, and then it had sent them home. Thousands of Vothan soldiers, who had ridden out certain they were the largest number in the room, came back to the hegemony alive, and every one of them carried the same line, because the human ship had given it to each of them the way it had given it to Senna. Count us once, and you will never need to count us again. The counting rooms did not know what to do with them. A Vothan soldier who lost a fight died in it. That was doctrine. These had lost the largest fight in the history of the hegemony and come home whole, sent back by the enemy on purpose, carrying the enemy's words, and the words were not propaganda and were not threats. They were arithmetic, and the soldiers had stood close enough to the truth to be unable to file it under boasting either. Senna found, to her quiet astonishment, that she had thousands of allies she had never met, scattered through the hegemony, every one of them a clerk, now whether they had ever held a slate or not, every one of them carrying the same true thing home. The human ship had not just spared them, it had turned them into the record. It had understood, better than the hegemony understood itself, that the only thing that beats a civilization built on numbers is a chorus of its own people saying, plainly, that the numbers do not work. It almost held. For half a cycle the hegemony wavered, the galleries full of returned soldiers, and the one true line, and Senna let herself believe the argument might be won without a second tide. But a civilization does not unbuild itself in half a cycle, and the tally lords who had never crossed the dark, who had only ever watched lights in a pool, looked at thousands of survivors and read them not as a record but as an insult, an enemy presuming to send their own soldiers back as messengers, and the insult demanded an answer, and the only answer a counting room can imagine is a larger number. So the wavering passed, and the certainty closed back over the hegemony like water over a stone, and the order went out. It took the hegemony 2 cycles to gather it. 10,000 hulls, the largest fleet in the history of the Vothan, drawn from 900 worlds, every heavy hull and every converted hauler and every drone belly the counting rooms could muster, and they named it the Tide of All Suns, and they pointed it at the blue world, and they told Senna to ride at the front of it as the quill master who would record the correction of the error. The hegemony did not believe her arithmetic, it believed its own, and it could not imagine, even now, even with the record in front of it, a room in which it was not the largest number. Senna rode at the front of the Tide of All Suns. She did not refuse. A clerk records, and someone had to be there to write down what the hegemony was about to learn, and she was the only one who already knew the ending. She sat in the gallery of the new flagship and watched 10,000 lights fill a muster pool 10 times the size of the one she had watched 2 cycles ago, and she felt the old satisfaction of a clean column try to rise in her, the certainty that a number this large could not lose, and she pushed it down, because she had stood in a cold cabin at the edge of Vothan space and heard a ship tell her why it kept only one. The Tide of All Suns crossed the dark. It took 6 days. On the 6th day it came down on the blue world, 10,000 hulls in a curtain so wide the human moon was lost inside it, and above the 3rd moon, exactly where it had hung for 40 days and 40 years and longer than the hegemony had existed, the single hull was waiting. It had not built a fleet of its own. It had not matched the tide ship for ship. It hung there alone, 200,000 tons of patient metal, and as the largest fleet in Vothan history bore down on it from every angle at once, it began, slow and clear, in the trade tongue, to broadcast its name. The last argument. The last argument. Once a breath, patient as a heartbeat, across the whole closing dark. Senna recorded it. She recorded all of it, because she was a clerk, and because the hegemony needed, this time, a record it could not skim. She recorded the first reaching, when the leading wing of the Tide of All Suns went dark. 4,000 hulls switched off in the space of a few breaths. The converted haulers' crews left alive in cold hulls drifting above the blue world the way the Hand of 40 Suns crews had been left 2 cycles before. She recorded the volley, the largest in the history of her people. 10,000 weapons fired together at one ship, and she recorded how the fire reached a certain distance from the human hull and ceased to exist, swallowed without flare, as if the space around the last argument had been told fire was not allowed there, and the fire had agreed. She recorded the second reaching, and the third, the finger of darkness walking through the Tide of All Suns, at its steady, unhurried pace, and she recorded the Tally Lord, on the flagship beside her watching his 10,000 lights go out, and understanding, far too late, that 10,000 and 1,000 had always been the same number to a weapon that beat the rules, instead of the ships. It took the last argument a little longer than it had taken with the Hand of 40 Suns. 10 times the ships is 10 times the afternoon, but it did not take 10 times anything else, because nothing else had changed. The human ship did not strain, it did not lose a panel. It hung above its moon and switched off the largest fleet in Vothan history hull by hull, calmly and completely and without raising its voice, and it left every soft crew alive that it could leave alive, because it wanted, more than it wanted to win, for every soldier who lived to carry the same line home. And when it was done, when the Tide of All Suns was a drift of cold stones above the blue world, and the muster pool of the flagship held one light, the flagship's own, the human ship spoke to Senna again, because it knew, somehow, that the clerk was aboard. "Quillmaster," it said, "you told them. I heard you tell them. You stood in the center of the great gallery, and you gave them the truth, and they built the tide anyway. That was not your failure. That was theirs. A record is only as good as the room that reads it, and the room chose not to, so we do it once more, and this time the record is too large to skim, and this time you take it home again, and this time perhaps the room reads it. And if it doesn't," Senna said, "if they build 100,000, a million, if they pour every world into a tide and come again, then I will be here," the last argument said, slow and clear, "above my moon, where I have always been, for as long as it takes. I do not tire, Quillmaster, and I do not run, and I do not lose, and I have nowhere to be but here, keeping my world quiet. A million ships is only a longer afternoon. I would rather it never came to that. I would rather your people read the record and stayed home and lived. But if they choose the tide again, I will switch off the tide again, and I will leave alive everyone I can, and I will send you home with the record again, until the room finally reads it or there is no hegemony left to send a room. That is the whole of it. That is the only choice your people have ever had, since the first scout filed the first report under boasting. Read us correctly and live. Read us wrong and send a tide, and watch it go dark, and read us correctly the next time. We are patient. We have been patient longer than your hegemony has had a name. We can be patient until you learn." Senna carried the record home a second time. The scout the human ship spared ran the 6 days back, and she wrote it, and she stood in the great gallery of the hegemony a second time and told the largest minds of her people that 10,000 ships had become cold stones above a blue world, and that one ship had done it without losing a panel, and that the line was still true, the same 11 words, and that it would be true at 100,000 ships and a million, because the human weapon did not count. This time, the room read it. It did not read it quickly, or gladly, or all at once. A civilization built on being the largest number does not unbuild itself in a single gallery. But the second record was too large to skim, and Senna was too close to the truth to be filed under boasting, and slowly, world by world, counting room by counting room, the hegemony did the one thing it had never done in 900 conquests. It stopped sending tides. Not out of fear, though there was fear, out of arithmetic. The tally lords ran the math the human ship had run, and the clerk had run, and it ended the same way every time, and at last the hegemony accepted the answer, because the hegemony, whatever else it was, had always believed its own numbers. And the numbers said the blue world could not be counted, so the Vothan stopped trying to count it. The blue world stayed quiet. The single hull stayed warm above its moon. And the 11 words, carried home twice by a clerk who had stood close enough to the truth to bear them, became the one entry in the Vothan archive that was never skimmed again, the line every new quillmaster read on their first day in the counting room, the line that kept the next tide home, and the one after that, and every one that the hegemony, in its long quiet decline from being the largest number into being merely an old people who had finally learned a limit, was ever tempted to send. Count us once, and you will never need to count us again. The change did not come from a decree. The hegemony had never been a thing that changed by decree. It changed the way a great fleet changes course, slowly, hull by hull, each counting room turning a little after the one beside it, until the whole vast tide was pointed somewhere it had never meant to go. And the thing that turned them, in the end, was not fear of the human ship. The Vothan had faced fearsome things before and counted their way through. What turned them was the arithmetic, the simple, unbearable arithmetic that Senna had carried home twice, and that the returned soldiers carried in their thousands, and that no counting room, once it finally sat down and did the sum honestly, could make come out any other way. 1,000 ships had become nothing, 10,000 had become nothing, and the line that connected them was not a curve that bent upward towards some number that would finally be enough. It was a flat line. It said the same thing at one ship and at 1,000,000. It said the blue world could not be counted, and a people who lived by counting could not, in the end, argue with a number that would not move. There were those who would not accept it even so. Senna recorded them, because she recorded everything, and because the record of who refused the truth was as important as the record of the truth itself. There was a tally lord named Vorn, of the old conquering line, who stood in the great gallery and called Senna a coward, and a turned clerk, who said that a hegemony that would not avenge 20,000 ships was no hegemony at all, who demanded a third tide larger than the first two combined. And Senna, who was only a clerk raised high, stood in the center of the great gallery and did not argue with him, because you cannot argue a creature out of a thing he did not reason his way into. She only read him the record, the muster of 1,040, the how, the road, the list of the human dead carried under the human voice, the mercy, the spared crews, the 11 words. She read it all, slowly, in the plain clear cadence she had learned from a ship across the dark, and when she was done, she said one thing of her own, the only thing she ever added to the record in her own voice, in all her long years in the gallery. She said that the blue world had buried 20,000 of its own to learn the lesson Vorn wanted to send a third tide to teach it, and that the lesson did not need teaching twice, and that the only question left to the hegemony was whether it would learn the lesson from the human record or from its own grave, and that both were available, and that the human record was cheaper. Vorn sent no third tide. No one did. Not because Vorn was persuaded. He was never persuaded. He went to his death certain the hegemony had grown weak. But the counting rooms around him did the sum, and the sum was flat, and a civilization built on numbers cannot send a tide its own arithmetic says will die. The road closed. The blue world stayed quiet, and the 11 words went into the deepest part of the Vothan archive, the part that is never skimmed, the part every new clerk reads on their first day. Senna grew old in the great gallery. She became a tally lord herself, in time, the only clerk in the history of the hegemony raised so high, and she was raised not for any conquest, but for a single record carried home twice from the edge of a blue world. She never forgot the cold cabin, or the patient voice, or the ship that kept only one of itself out of a grave the galaxy had never seen. And when she was very old, and the young clerks came to her gallery to learn the trade, she told them the one thing she had learned that the Vothan had no column for, the thing the last argument had spoken with grief, underneath its slow, clear voice. 1,000 ships is how you become the thing you fought. The humans had been a tide once. They had buried themselves learning what a tide costs, and out of that grave they had built not 1,000 ships but one, and kept it warm above their home, and never used it on anyone who did not first cross the dark to make them kneel. They had been offered, by every law of power the galaxy knew, the chance to be the largest number in every room there was, to be the Vothan but more, and they had looked at that chance, with the memory of their own grave behind their eyes, and they had said, no. One ship, enough, and not a gram of killing more than the argument required. That, Senna told the young clerks, was the real reason 1,000 ships were not enough. Not the weapon, though the weapon was the how. The reason was that the Blue World had already paid, long ago, in its own dead, the price the Vothan were trying to make it pay, and a people who have already buried their tide cannot be frightened by yours. They have seen the end of the math. They built one ship to make sure no one ever made them do that math again. She lived long enough to see the hegemony become a quieter thing, a people who counted their worlds and held them, and sent no more tides, who remembered, every time a young warmaster grew hungry for a number, the single hull above a distant moon, and the 11 words in the unskimmed entry. She lived long enough to know that the human ship had won the argument the way it had always meant to, by being right, and that the proof of the winning was not a conquered world or a darkened fleet, but a quiet one, the Vothan and the Blue World both, neither sending tides at the other across the long dark. And when Senna died, very old, in the great gallery she had been raised to lead, the last entry she made in the Vothan archive was not about a battle. It was about a ship she had met once, across the dark, that had unmade 2 of her people's tides without losing a panel, and had spared every life it could spare, and had sent her home twice with the truth, because it wanted the truth carried more than it wanted the winning. She did not call the entry a defeat. She had never called it a defeat. She titled it, in the same small, careful hand she had used in a cold cabin 2 lifetimes ago, with the word the ship had given itself, the word that was not a war, because it could be won by being right. The argument, closed, won by the smaller number, once, completely, and never needing to be won again. And below it, last of all, she wrote the line one more time, the way she had written it the first time and every time since, the 11 words that one ship had given one clerk to carry home, so that 1,000 more ships would never have to die learning them. Count us once, and you will never need to count us again. The Blue World is quiet still. The single hull hangs warm above its moon, patient as it has always been, presenting its full length to the dark, waiting for a tide that no longer comes. It has never lost a panel. It has never needed to. The galaxy sent 1,000 ships, and then 10,000, and humanity only ever needed the one, because the one was not built to beat a fleet. It was built to end the argument, and it did.